All right. Good afternoon. Well, almost afternoon, 10 minutes away. I think we're going to get started because we're very short on time. So I sort of introduced myself in the last session, but I'll do so again. My name is Sabina Dewan. I'm the executive director of a think tank called the Just Jobs Network that focuses on strategies for job creation and workforce development. I'm also a senior fellow with the Center for Policy Research here in Delhi. I wanted to thank the Observer Research Foundation and the hosts of today's meeting, the University of Pennsylvania, for the invitation for me today to moderate what I think is a very important topic, which is the issue of gender equity, and in particular, political participation of women in these sort of troubled times. For decades now, we've been talking about women's rights and participation, but gender equality in many parts of the world continues to be elusive. According to the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report 2020, we won't see gender parity for another 100 years. So certainly none of us in our lifetime are going to see gender parity. The report measures 4 dimensions, and the good news is that we've seen some advancement, some progress on educational attainment as well as health and survival. But the problem is that these gains have not translated into better economic and political outcomes for women. On the economic participation and opportunity dimension, which is the 3rd dimension, there's a slight increase in the number of women in leadership positions in corporations. But around the world, we continue to see that women's labor force participation rates are either still low, stagnant, or even declining. And wage and income gaps continue to be very large and in some cases still growing. We need not look far. Let's look at what the discussion here in India is. There's a great deal of discussion over the declining female labor force participation rate. There are fewer than 1 in 4 women in the labor market here in India, and that's just a hair above Saudi Arabia. So for a country that considers itself to be the largest democracy in the world and that it has been growing at relatively high rates until recently, the fact that female labor force participation rates are declining and that we continue to struggle with gender equity to such an extent is really unfortunate. But the World Economic Forum report also highlights that the biggest gender gap is actually when it comes to political empowerment of women. And there is a lot of research that actually shows that the more politically empowered women are and the more women there are in politics, the better the economic outcomes for women. And again, in India, for example, we see that there's been an increase in the number of women in the Lok Sabha. It's now increased up to 14%. But many of these women, but this number is still low. Political participation of women in India is well below the global average. And we find that a lot of women that are in politics actually come from families that have legacies of being in politics. So what does that say for all the other women that are hoping to have political aspirations? So this brings me to the key question that I'd like to put forth on the table today. There has been a lot of emphasis that's been put on gender equity. There's been a lot of political rhetoric around it. We've got the SDG that focuses on gender equity. We've got philanthropic money that's going into programming for gender equity, CSR funding, and yet parity is still elusive. Why is that? Why is it that despite such active participation and almost frenetic activity on this subject, is there still this huge gap? And I submit to you that one of the questions and one of the potential reasons is that it is much more convenient for us to focus on economic empowerment because that lends itself to more quantitative indicators rather than deal with the difficult questions about addressing cultural norms and patriarchy that is at the root of gender inequities. So with that, I would like to open it up to my panelists and welcome my fellow panelists today that are going to help us unpack some of the reasons behind what are the equities that continue to exist and how do we actually address these inequities in a concrete, tangible way for a 21st century economy. First, I would like to welcome Malgorzata Bonikowska, who's the president. Did I do okay? All right. Who's the president of the Center for International Relations in Poland. I will also go ahead and welcome my other two panelists, and then we'll go in turn. Mr. R.S. Vasan, who's the director of the Chennai Center for China Studies. And finally, Ms. Renu Addlakha, who's Dr. Renu Addlakha, who's professor at the Center for Women's Development Studies. So let me turn first to Malgorzata. If you could tell us a little bit about women's political participation and particularly the link between economic participation and political participation, given your experience and work in Europe.
Thank you very much. For those who find my name difficult, you can call me Gogo. It's just much simpler. Actually, I specialize in European Union. I am a political scientist, so I rarely discuss women's issues. Actually, I have to say, many professional women in Europe don't like to do that. But if I have to contribute to this panel, I would like to give you some statistics first, because you may have this impression that Europe should be a little bit maybe advanced more than the world as far as equality. That's actually our objective. We have a European Union as an organization which stresses all the time that we want really to give equal opportunities and have equal participation of women everywhere. As you heard, we have now a new commission run by a woman, Ursula von der Leyen, and her goal was also to create a new European Commission equal, and that was done. So it's really 50-50 women and men in the Commission. However, that's only a top of the mountain, because when you dig into that issue deeper, you see that Europe is not so equal as you may think. When you look at the data, the European Parliament is worse. European Parliament now has started the new term in July. We have only 40% of women members of European Parliament, which is slightly, higher than it was, maybe, but average is still not 50-50. So it's 40% women, 60% men. However, this also differs as far as the national parliaments. You know that we still have 28 member states until Brexit happens the end of January. But if you look at national parliaments in European Union, then you will see a lot of differences. We have countries like, I will just quote some examples, like Sweden or Finland. Scandinavia generally is more equal. Then we have in national parliaments more women than men. But we have also countries like Slovakia or like Greece or like Bulgaria or Estonia or even Poland. Then there are much less women in national parliaments than men. The lowest rate is in Slovakia. It's 21% in national parliament only. Average would be, that in national parliaments, there are some countries we have 50-50, and it will be like Malta, like Luxembourg, like Dutch, Holland, France, it is 50-50 really, 50% of women, 50% of men. But my point is that Europe is really, not one. It's it varies. It's different in every single member state. But that's one coin of the dime. If you look at business, go out of politics, let's look at business. In the business, women are quite, equal, and on the medium side, decision-making level, medium managers, the managers of departments, etc. But if you go on the top, more on the top, less women, and especially in the business. And here you have the opposite statistics, that in the Western Europe, especially countries like Luxembourg, the women are very, very few, especially in financial sector services. So to give you statistics precisely, it's only 15% women top positions in business in Luxembourg. Only 20% in Cyprus, only 29% in Netherlands, 29% in Italy. So Western Europe is not really so equal in business statistics. And you may think, paradox is that Eastern Europe is much better. The highest women's presentation in business is in Latvia and Bulgaria and Estonia and Poland and Slovenia. It's almost 50%. So it's the opposite. We could say in politics, it's much better in the West. In business, it's still not so good in the West, as you may think. When you look at women's rights to vote, you normally think also, oh, it's the Western concept. Yes, maybe, but the first country in the world to give the women's rights to women was New Zealand. And then Australia. New Zealand in 1893, the oldest, not Europe. I come from the country, Poland, who was relatively quick in that, because we gave to women rights to vote in 1918. But France did it only in 1944. And Switzerland, I think, was the last in Europe. It was in the 70s. So we are quite, we could say, quite conservative as far as this. And of course, it has consequences in the social life, because we are still having this kind of concept. Many people believe, many people are still conservative in the mindset in Europe, even in the Western Europe, and many people believe that when women have really equal rights to work and to be active in politics, in business, everywhere, then it influences badly the family. And there are some politicians, especially in the parties who are radical right, who say, okay, let's back to normal. Let's have women at home first. Otherwise, we will not have normal families, and we will have a problem with the continuation of generations. We'll have not enough children. And that's, by the way, that's the European challenge today, because that's a fact that the population of Europe is not growing so fast, especially in some countries. Like mine, Poland, we have a huge problem with statistics as far as birth rates. So my final point is that we in the West, and especially in Europe, we still have a lot to work on. And the key solutions to the situation, how to really have parity, how to have really 50-50, would be, I think, the family-oriented programs, support for women, and also encouraging women to be active publicly. More women are active, more a new standard is promoted. Like, for example, we have situation in which we have discussions in the media only with men. So there are more and more reactions to that people don't want to watch it anymore, especially when the men discuss issues like abortion or healthcare or family. So there is a new standard that it should be women, if not 50-50, at least one woman. Then there are also conferences when still, we are not a good example, thanks God, but we have many conferences where only men discuss the issues. So the new practice in Europe is that there are people who boycott such conferences. They just don't come. Or we have regulations promoting women's participations, like quota system, right? That's the most popular. Women still, professionals don't like it too much because they don't want to be selected just because there is a rule to take a woman somewhere on the party list or to the board of managers in the company. But the reality is that without quota, it doesn't really happen so often. We still have banks, huge financial institutions, huge, corporate companies without any woman on top in the management boards. And finally, we have strong promotion of role models. Maybe you've heard about the BBC survey, top 100 women in the world, the impact, who was really the most significant in history as a woman. And I'm very proud to announce that this was a Polish woman called Marie Curie Skłodowska. She was a scientist and she got a Nobel Prize in chemistry and physics twice, the only person who got the Nobel Prize in these two disciplines twice. So role models like her, help to encourage women, especially in disciplines like chemistry or physics, to be more active, but they are also role models of today, living people. And I think by promoting these ladies, I think we also get very good results, because the other women look at the women and they feel encouraged. We can name many people today, like a Prime Minister of New Zealand, who is very popular, being quite an interesting figure, or persons who get Nobel prizes. Like recently, there was also a Polish woman in literature nominated. So I think it's still a lot to do, but a lot depends how people react and what people do themselves today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for kind of giving us a picture of the diversity across countries in Europe in terms of gender equity. I think it's also very important to point out that some of the countries that have fared the best in terms of gender equity, Iceland and then the Scandinavian countries, are countries that have a very strong set of policies that are oriented towards families and providing flexible schedules and support to women that want to enter the workforce, as well as quotas for women's participation on corporate boards. So these are, sort of tried and tested examples. Of course, there's pros and cons to the whole quotas debate, but thank you for bringing that up. I think it's really important. Next, I'd like to turn to Renu. If I could, Renu, if I could ask you to please address, given your background and your experience, to specifically talk a little bit about this tension between sort of focus on economic empowerment. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg. Focus on economic empowerment versus addressing some of the more deeply engendered cultural norms and sort of, patriarchy that keep women from actually even participating fully in the labor markets. If you could talk a little bit about that, that would be great.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Sabina. So I think we need to do a bit of a shift in the discursive terms that we're using, because I don't come from economics. I come from social anthropology and sociology. So my approach to some of the issues that have been raised, some of the questions that have raised from a gender perspective, will be framed in a slightly less statistical and less economics terms, but I think nowadays it's an era of interdisciplinarity, so that should not be be more complementary than in any way contradictory or in any way diversionary. Thank you for addressing so many of the issues with regard to gender inequity, because then I don't have to do it. I can just go on to some of the issues that I think are important, taking off from the previous presentation and from Sabina's introductory remarks, and in that process I hope to address your query. Now, if we look at, having more women or having a gender perspective, as we call it, actually has macro level ramifications. This is not a micro level process of having more women, having more 50% of the population as part of various places or various institutional frameworks from which, apart from the family, they have been excluded. So for example, there is greater political stability and public security when there are more women, when there is more women's participation, not only in the workforce, but in society. And to give you an example, there's a whole thing in Delhi, in the cities of India we have, of safe cities and violence against women. And actually, it's been found that when you have cities where there are more women roaming at different times of the day, where there is better lighting and there is a greater consideration of the women's participation in the public sphere, that place is not only felt to be safe, but there is also a decline in crime rates. So there is some truth to that. So that has a macro level thing. The other thing is when you have more women in the sphere, when you see more women, when you engage with women, invariably there will be conflicts over gender norms, and that has been, we know that, we all experience that. But over time, there will be a transformation in gender norms. The power differential that works within genders, men talking first, women, the whole issue of mansplaining that's called, these will over time, if you see more women, get normalized, and hence a new gender order of more egalitarianism and equity in between men and women at both micro and macro levels is likely to be attained. Now I'm going to go into some of the issues that were addressed, for example, women's representation in the political sphere, which was mentioned. Why do we want more women? I mean, what will it eventually do? The political female politicians that we, at least in India, have, I don't see them as exemplary. They are role models. Are they? I don't know. They're there. But I mean, how did they get there? Why are they there? As we say, there are family dynasties. So, but if there's a critical mass, I mean, you do have 33% representation in parliament of women. Invariably, when there's a critical mass, the issues of women and the issues of gender will come in, and there will be hopefully a cascading effect in terms of policies and in terms of general to society. And that is why there is a need for more presence of women, because it's not just one or two women or one or two exceptional women who are going to actually make a difference. You need the critical mass. And the other thing we need to take into account, which is often not mentioned, is the gender hierarchies among women. I mean, we know women is not a homogeneous category. There is caste, there is class, there is region, there are so many other, there is education, there's so many variables. How do you negotiate these gender hierarchies, And that's something for women who come into public sphere to actually consciously take on board, because there are inequalities between women. From one perspective, block of women, one group, but within women, there is where patriarchy comes into play. And we don't need to really think of examples, they're very much there, how patriarchy conditions women's participation and women's empowerment issues. Next, if we come into I think we need more. The women in the private sector is a major employer in today's economic system. And there you find, yes, women are on boards. They should be there. We need more. Glass ceilings have been broken at some level. But there is also a clustering of women in the private sector in what I would call as care roles. They're into scenarios, the hospitality industry, nursing. These are extensions of domestic roles. So we have to think, is the public sphere making a space for women in roles in which they are already there in terms of the family? And is that all right? I mean, are we okay with the nursing profession being predominantly dominated by women? Or do we need to think about that? It's a question. I think in the morning, Professor Manoj Panda talked about the role of, the non-profit sector and philanthropy in decreasing inequalities. Well, in that, the women are already there in a large extent. And I think there is where we need to think how that presence of women can be leveraged in terms of addressing wider issues, instead of just being looked at as, CSR and charity and, the kind of soft option. So that's just a question that I have. I just want to raise a couple of more points, and then I'll finish. Family. Now, you have it, it's a conservative issue, keep women at home, but when women come out of the home, what about the family? Now, the point is where in societies there is child care policy, there is social security, a kind of a social security foundation or support, it makes sense. But in a scenario where many women who are, say, from lower income groups, who are coming into the workforce, what about their families? What about childcare? Not all organizations offer childcare services. What about care for the elderly? What about care for the disabled? These invariably often, even in the family, the women, even if she's working, is still the fulcrum of the family and is still the fulcrum of care at the micro level. And then we go on to, the issue of if you have care at the micro level, what about care work, the care economy at the wider level, given that there is across the world, and including India, China, populations are aging, and there is a huge, now burden on the system. What are we going to do about that? Is it that women are again going to be channelized into this scenario of care work? We already have it in the case of domestic work. There's a lot of migration of women, both, say, within India, internal migration, and between different countries for domestic work, because domestic work is an economy where women dominate. So that's kind of a global concern with regard to women's participation in the workforce and, where they are. The other issue that I'd like to address is someone said, in the morning, automation is not a big problem in India because, it's 17% manufacturing, robots are not going to take over. But, automation moves very fast. And there are already sectors like the banking sector in India where automation has come in. So when you have a scenario of automation, you have a scenario of unemployment, you have men and women. What is the scenario? What is going to happen? How are you going to get, are you going to, it seems to me that there's going to be a kind of direct conflict at times between men and women. And how do we resolve that? The other issue is violence. We're having a hanging in the next, on the 22nd. There is a kind of a great support for capital punishment for violent, heinous crimes against women. What does that talk about in terms of populism and gender issues in the context here? So I think there are a range of issues that are thrown up by gender with regard to the macro level processes and factors, and they go beyond the economic sphere, and there's an intersectionality between violence and the economy, and between the economy and sexual and reproductive health. The whole issue of abortion in other parts of the world, which in India we're not confronting in that kind of direct way. So I think we need to, it's she speaks, but I think it's really they or the world speaks when we incorporate issues of gender equity and inequality in our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renu, for widening the scope of the discussion to include aspects of safety, gender hierarchies among women, violence against women, and also how improving the visibility of women can actually lend itself to better outcomes. I also agree with you that on the automation question, for me personally, I think the issue of automation is less the concern as with technology as is the skill-biased change. Technology is essentially skill-biased. It requires a higher level of education, a higher level of literacy in order to be able to engage with it. And this is particularly relevant when it comes to women, because women are often excluded from obtaining the kinds of access to technology and the kinds of skills they need to be able to participate in a rapidly changing 21st century economy. So it's not, when we talk about technology, it's not just about automation, but also about the possibility of it, not even possibility, fact of it being skill biased and how that has an impact on gender equity. So with that, I will turn to Dr. Vasan to please offer his insights. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I'm in a minority here in this panel, number one. And number two, I'm the last panelist. So therefore, whatever I am supposed to say has already perhaps been said. Yet I'll make an attempt to try and sum up what I think about this entire issue. To me, this is one of the most important sessions here in this think tank forum. The heading that was given was with the hashtag She Leads. That is a hashtag that was there, very imaginative, because it raises a lot of questions. So if you accept that she leads, how does she lead? Does she do it on her own? Or is it with the support of people like us who are here to discuss this issue? What kind of support would she need if she has to lead? So, unfortunately, I think Chair has already said that, for next 100 years, perhaps we will not see this gender equality. So unless we really start doing something about this, it may become 200 years. So which is where I think these discussions help in trying to see that there is greater participation in politics and policy. I think there's a whole core issue here, because I think the reference was also about women participation in think tanks and also in politics. So this is where we are here. I think it's already summed up with the support of statistics. I'll not quote any statistics over here. But what's evident is that the due that's required, we are not giving it, obviously. Within India, of course, for all the Indians are quite familiar with this, some of these things that I'm going to say in the next 2 minutes. But for the benefit of our foreign friends, in our Indian homes, we are told, Matru Devo Bhava. Mother is God. Then Pitru Devo Bhava. Father is God. And then, of course, teacher. Acharya Devo Bhava. No, these are things that start off at the home, when you start respecting women. You go to any village today in India, any town, you'll find so many temples dedicated to Ammas. Whether it's Lakshmi, whether it's Kali, whether it is whatever. So in the societal structure, there is a place for women. But when you come to the streets, what do you see? The same thing is not replicated. Whether it's because of various things that have happened in the past, whether it's because of the way you look at women and the place that they occupied, you find that, there is a certain amount of contradiction in the way about how we are brought up to respect women and what we do on the streets. This is the contradiction that we need to address if women have to find their rightful place. So look at South Asia. This is another important phenomena. When did Sirimao Bandaranaike come into politics? And you cut in our neighborhood. Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina. In India, Indira Gandhi. In Pakistan, Benazir Bhutto. So wherever you look at South Asia, they have been in leadership positions. That means the system has supported and accepted the role of women in politics and policy making. So yet, when you look at the larger population, the statistics is what holds out. And that's a point for concern. I think Sweden was the first nation that came out with a policy, and I think they called this the feminist foreign policy. A lot of eyebrows were raised in 2018, and they said, what is this feminist foreign policy? So, but when you look at it, you really understand that there's a need for governments and the societies to hold up this value system that supports women in politics, in think tanks, and etc. Just before we started, I think there was a side dialogue that was going on when a question was asked to Ambassador Mohan Kumar as to how many women are in his organization. So, he did say that, yes, it's at the lower end it's better, but at the senior level. This afflicts all of us in think tanks. All of us here are from think tanks. When you look around, you realize that luckily over here, at least in this forum, there is an equitable distribution of what you want to call as gender equality, where in think tanks we have. But how many think tanks are headed by women? We need to look at it. There are very few. You can put your hands up and we'll know. And this is not something which we need to be very proud of. So this is where we really need to sensitize the people and the thinking community about how to do it. In our own think tanks, Chennai Center for China Studies, there was a Chinese delegation which came here. Are the Chinese professors still here? No. Yeah. So there's a very interesting findings that came out as far as the Chinese society is concerned. We titled it as, Will Women Hold Up Half the Sky? That was the title of the seminar that we held, where we had Chinese participation. There were people from China, from Taiwan who came in there. And we found that there are a lot of cultural baggage that drove the way we treated women both in China and India. If you go back to Confucius, you find some of that prescriptions was like our Manusmriti. on one hand we say Matrudeva Bhava, on another hand you say Na Stri Swatantra Marhati, which means that, women do not deserve freedom. And, this is the kind of contradiction which I brought about earlier. Even in the Confucian society, they have said that women in their societies should be governed by husbands, by parents, and then by somebody else, and never on their own. So this is what came out in that conference there, and luckily for us, there were people both from China and Taiwan. Just across the straits, you find Tsai has been re-elected with a sounding majority. Whereas in China, when you look at the percentage of people in the party or in the NPC, you find it is less than 20%. On paper, you say that, there is equality, but it's not so in China. It's not so in India either. So, in fact, they are not better off than us in the sense that anybody who pursues a PhD in China and is beyond 27 years old, they got a very bad term for them. They're called the discarded women. This is the kind of attitude that's there, which unfortunately doesn't bring up the societies which we look at. So instead of raising all these questions about this hashtag of she leads, the questions that I raised about how can we ensure that she leads, whether it's in economy, politics, think tanks, etc. I think time is also running out, so I'll just come to some specific recommendations which are there, so that we look at it in think tanks and also ensure that there is greater participation of the other gender in all our discussions. So one is about, these are specific recommendations which we can go back and look at perhaps. Campus recruitment. How many think tanks are really going to the campus today to recruit women thinkers? It's happening on its own because somebody wants to come and be in a think tank, get a PhD or, add to their CV. But otherwise, where is it that we are canvassing and saying that, this is a job for you and you can be a success in think tanks? That we are not doing. And more opportunities for internship and research. It's again happening on its own. We are not going out saying that, we'll enable you. I'm quite happy and proud to say that, of the interns we've had in C3S, 3 of them are pursuing PhD in China today. No, I think this has to reach out to say that, there is a dividend if you pursue these kind of activities in think tanks and policy formulations. More programs with universities. I think, it's all restricted to the think tank, what think tanks can do. I feel that we need to go out and have more programs with universities, women institutions, and, tell them what is it that we are capable of doing. Unless we are able to do this, I don't think we'll go very far in bringing down this 100 years that was quoted as something that will restrict us in providing them equal opportunity. Quota system for women. I think this also came out, this 33% or whatever, including in think tanks and other dynamic organizations. We need to ensure that there is quota system because that's the only way that they will come up. India has practiced the quota system for that. There are pros and cons of a quota system, but the point is, at least when it comes to gender equality, we should be able to provide these opportunities through a quota system that increases their number, and therefore the lateral thinking and the dissemination of thought process on either side, which will do it. So before we talk about, will women hold up half the sky, which is the whole theme, there is a lot more that we need to do, both individually in our own individual capacities, as well as at the governmental level and at the think tank level. And only then we can look at bridging this gap that exists today for various reasons which have already been highlighted by the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of my panelists for very insightful remarks, but also for keeping time. So with that, we have about 15 minutes, and we can open it up to some questions. So I'll start with this side. So we'll go 1, 2, and then 3, and 4. Oh, I'm sorry. And then we'll come back.
Unless you want to go first, Melissa. Thank you. My name's Erin. I'm from the Perth US Asia Centre. And thank you all panellists for your very different observations. It was really useful. While I'm at the Perth US Asia Centre as a senior fellow, I wear one other hat. I'm the head delegate for Australia at the W20, which is the G20's women engagement group, and also have run for pre-selection for the Liberal Party in Australia, unsuccessfully, but have had that experience as a political actor as well. This year with the G20, Australia's agenda is focused on the fact that once you take Angela Merkel out of the family photo at the G20, there are no women leaders in the G20. It is appalling. And so for the last couple of years when we've been in Japan and Argentina, we've focused very much on other policies that might help enable women in the economy and so on. But this year we're going and just saying, look, if you can't even have, if you don't have any female leaders in the G20, what hope is there for the women of the G20? And so we want to push the G20 to actually look at themselves and their own representation and how women are represented. That's going to be really difficult. I think that we're at a really problematic time when it comes to international relations and women in leadership, because we're going into we've got Saudi Arabia this year. That's going to be challenging to deal with a number of issues. We absolutely cannot talk about reproductive issues, which is something the Australian government would love us to talk about at the W20. We can't do that. But I just wanted to make two other really quick points. Duflo, who just won our Nobel Prize for her work in poverty alleviation, has written some great work on the role of perception of women in leadership, particularly they did research in Rajasthan and Bihar on reservation and quotas. And one of the conclusions was that it's actually about the perception of women leaders. So initially we think that women don't deliver the same in terms of goods and services for the community as male leaders, but over time that effect actually falls away. So it's about exposure to women in leadership. And the other point I really wanted to make here was actually from my personal experience and something we talk a lot about in Australia and hasn't been mentioned here, and that is the media's treatment of women, particularly in politics. So we've got 2 women running for provincial level premiers in Australia. This is an historical election, and yet front page of the newspaper is what brand jacket they're wearing. We talk about their personal lives, their sex lives, their families. We don't talk about policy. So there's a role that the media is not playing in enabling women in leadership as well. Why would you want to go into politics if that's how you're going to be treated? So I guess they're more comments than they are questions, but I'd like to hear your reflections on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you for an excellent set of comments. I'm sorry, but we are running out of time, so we just need to keep it a little bit short. So we'll do a quick round. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ejaz Malgorzata from Afghanistan. I work with the Afghan Institute for Strategic Studies as a researcher and external relations officer. We do research on peace, conflict, elections, democracy, and also work on women's empowerment. I would like to draw the attention here from the She Leads hashtag to let girls learn. We're still in that stage that families don't let their girls to study. I come from a family where last year when I was getting married, we were discussing, I was discussing with my family about letting my wife to study because they were not, going to let her to study. So I was successful in that fight. She just graduated. I think the quota system is a great example. In Afghanistan, we have 1/3 of the parliament, women members, female members in our parliament, and that in the same in the government we have ambassadors, we have ministers, deputy ministers, some of them in very symbolic positions, not in decision making, but we need more women because in a country like Afghanistan where we see ongoing war now for more than 40 years, when women take lead, we have great outcomes. And we're still having discussions on bringing women, there's peace process going on, and we really need to bring women because the peace process led by Zalmay Khalilzad, I don't know if anyone is aware of it, is led by a one man and that's only a man, and there's no woman from Department of State there to, be this, in the decision making in the peace process, let alone having Afghan women in the peace process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Did you also?
Yeah.
So
I'm
very
just going to keep it
quick, yeah.
short. I think my argument, I'm Madina Guloba. I come from the Economic Policy Research Center, Uganda, as a senior research fellow. I think the issue here is, I've seen that no matter how many women you have in parliament, still we're not seeing the results of their power. And the issue is, other than those, the one they're talking about, the CEDAW, where the 25% will be women representatives, the directly related positions, where women have to stand with men for that position, it's just 2%. And there is the culture issue behind it, that how do you stand with a man? You're trying to make them look like they have empty trousers. So, and then the economic issue around it, that you need money to move into politics, and women do not have that kind of money. So how do we make sure that there is this political muscle, political willingness, of course the political economy will matter here, and the money to drive women to stand for the directly related positions, without you being saying you have to be divorced for you to be there. And then the issue around when you see the jobs that if the president puts in a woman for the ministerial position, the mindset around it, even what she said about media, that I think she gained that job because it's a red carpet job. I think she had to sleep with someone. There's that mindset, which is so wrong, that you could not have gotten that ministerial position because you had the papers to do it. So then we have this mindset around it, which is not really fair. And then, and the other bit of these 25% who came through the women representative positions, we don't feel their impact because they have the 3 S's labeled on them. They are supposed to be seen, serve, and second what the other men MPs have actually put in place. So there is a lot of ongoing, so we need a lot in terms of mindset and knowledge, awareness, of what women can do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's so many hands, and so I'm going to take, you had one question, so I'll take a question from you and then you. And I'm so sorry, gentlemen, but I will have to exercise my right as the chair. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Raosai from Mumbai School of Thoughts, Mumbai. My question is about the governance and transparency and corruption, something different from this economic and social aspect. We see in terms of corruption across the world at political leadership.
Is this related to gender?
Yeah, gender. I'm talking, but from that perspective, corruption and all this governance point of view. And as my observe, it's not based on a study, but just general observe. We find in corruption kind of in list, male names are there like in corruption things, and male are like the scenario like the male are more corrupted than women. So my question like is she less corrupted? Even women are there in governance and leadership. So is she less corrupted or just lack of? It's a matter of the lack of opportunity to get such kind of things.
Thank you for that question.
Which raises a wonderful question about essentialism.
If you have any answers to that.
Well, that's right.
No, it's an interesting one. It's that sort of essentialism. Are we putting women into positions because they are better, because they're nicer and kinder and less corrupt, or is it more a civic thing that if we want our societies to function, all members of our society should be part, which is always an interesting question about when you're talking about women's involvement. I wanted to talk just very briefly, I'm conscious of time, around work on women in diplomacy in particular. So this is something I've been involved in for about 10 years, and we've actually seen enormous improvements. So I like sharing the positive case study to say that there actually are some things we can see over that sort of time frame. There's a few key things. So if you're looking at numbers, the number of female ambassadors in Australia has gone from about 18% to over 25%, heading up towards 28% over that sort of period. What worked? Okay, first is something called Male Champions for Change. Our federal Sex Discrimination Commissioner set up this program where senior men would sign up to be male champions for change. And if they did that, they had to look at gender balance in their organisations, and they had to make commitments to things like not speaking on all male panels, etc. What I loved about that was it made it a competition between men. It's not a women's issue, it's not a side issue, it's a productivity issue. My organisation is doing better because I get the best talent in the country because I'm not leaving out half of the workforce. Okay, and that made a huge difference. Boasting between men helped. Second, that led to the Department of Foreign Affairs under a male leader setting up a women's leadership strategy. Key things there. One was a target for women's senior women, not quotas, and in our context, quotas are seen more negatively, whereas targets are great. They're essentially saying, if you're a manager, I'm saying your target is to have, say, 30%, 40% women in senior positions. If you haven't got there, why did you fail? Okay? And that's the way you're putting it. You're failing on something which is one of our important organisational issues, you fix it. Flexibility. So flexibility was having an if not, why not. All senior jobs can be flexible to allow room for family responsibilities unless there's an operational reason why they can't. And finally, just some really small things on hiring, looking at gendered language, how we talk about jobs. Is a job all about going out there and achieving goals or nurturing relationships? That does make a difference to who applies and who doesn't. Having equal men and women on hiring panels and having an equal number of men and women you interview. All of those made really clear, demonstrable differences. So if anyone's interested in more of the data on that, very happy to share it.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for rushing the discussion. We've just got the minister waiting, so if I could just turn it over to my fellow panelists to just give, basically in a minute, your sort of one thought that you want to leave everybody with. And Gogo, we'll start with you.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, I think mental maps matter. I think all depends on us what kind of society we want to be in and how do we see role of the women in these societies in the future. That's point number one. At the moment, for example, education system plays a huge role, and in Scandinavia, still the most advanced, they started already to change the curriculum in order not to print the social roles into the gender. So this gives results. If a girl or a boy are treated really equally and are taught the same things, then not necessarily the new generation will see the social roles in the same way. So conservative story about putting women back to the family only, it will not work. And you can observe it in new generations, a generation called smart generation, teenagers, that they are not having such big problems in, dividing the society, men, women, girls, boys. They pretty much, want to do the same things. So it's a lot to do with education. But still, the decision makers mostly are in the age of, 40, 50, 60, 70. So today, those who take decisions see the world in a very much very often in quite conservative way. See Donald Trump. So this has influence on what is happening now. For example, that if we have minister positions, there are people who say, okay, Minister of Education, yes, a woman can take it, but Minister of Defense, not really. It's also a perception. Current perception. Of course, there are many exceptions because Ursula von der Leyen just apparently was a Minister of Defense in Germany and Angela Merkel is a Chancellor, but these are still exceptions, not the standard. And last point is that we don't change this perception without men. Men are crucial, not women. Women can discuss many times the women's roles, but it's actually also men's perception of women's roles in the society. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Very, very quickly, please.
I've been told 1 minute, so let me take 1 minute. This is specific to my friend Mumbai's comments about, when whether women, because of lack of opportunities, are not as corrupt as men are. But I suppose it all finally boils down to the numbers that you have. You look at the numbers of people who are representing. Only I would like to say, though I have already given the recommendations, I'd like to end with what Mahatma Gandhi had to say about this, which is that there is enough for everyone's need in this world, but not enough for even one man's greed. So greed is gender neutral. So let's get this straight. And so I'll leave it at that. So the rest of the things I have already said, so I do not want to add many more. Thank you.
Minute, but I'm going to we talked about women's representation in parliament and other governance bodies, but we also have to look at women's participation in the electoral process. And there, in countries like India, women's participation in the electoral process has over time increased significantly at various levels of the electoral process. So I think that needs to be noted. The other is women and the media. So the media is the black guy, which is painting women on their brands and their looks and all that. But we must remember the media is largely connected with the advertising industry. And there is a commodification of the female body, Cadillacs and women. There's no connection, but they'll be there. And maybe the figures show that such advertisements work. But also we are noticing now more also commodification of the male body. So maybe a more gender neutral phenomenon is emerging in the advertising industry. And lastly, the last thing I would like to talk about is leadership, women's leadership. I mean, there's quotas and all. The idea is that, you're getting women in because you need women, and there's a certain partiality about it, and it's not fair and all that. But I think the thing to be emphasized is that even if quotas are being used, there should be no sacrifice of competence. Competence is primary, and you must be recognized by your competence. And I think if you are competent enough and assertive enough, and that training is given to women in leadership roles, eventually the misperceptions around women's leadership will disappear over time, and disappear in various contexts where women are functioning as leaders. Eventually people will see what kind of leaders you are. And the perceptions will be challenged at that level by experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much to my panelists and to all the participants.